This is a conversation with music entertainment attorney Cassandra Spangler. Today we are discussing music ownership. The information provided in this video is for informational purposes only and not for the purpose of providing legal advice. You should contact an attorney to obtain advice with respect to any particular issue or problem. So we are here once again with music attorney Cassandra Spangler. Thanks for joining us again, Cassandra.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And I'm sure that people that are listening to this recording absolutely already know that we did a wonderful interview a few months ago where you went over all of the basic and the overview type things for people that want to get into the music industry. And again, the feedback on that was fabulous. So people keep watching. If you haven't seen it, definitely go watch that. But today we're going to get into some specifics around music ownership. And that has been a hot topic. I mean, it's not new, but it becomes a hot topic every time some big celebrity gets into a situation. And you can correct me, but the one that I'm thinking of is the whole Taylor Swift thing.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, you hear this kind of buzzword that people want to own their own masters. And I think they get it from, like you said, every few years you'll hear a big situation arise with a popular artist, most recently Taylor Swift, where the artist is complaining or negotiating to try to buy back their masters. So then whenever that happens, I get a lot of people coming into the office or calling and saying, I want to own my masters. So I think it's good we're doing this because a lot of people probably don't really understand exactly what that means. So hopefully this will help to clarify that.
I think it definitely will. So let's just start right there. How's that? What is a master?
So a master is basically the original studio recording of your music. So the kind of master tapes used to always be done on tape. Now, some people still use tape. Other people use, it's all digital, which is something that, an interesting topic to raise with producers and engineers about tape versus digital. But either way, the master recording is kind of the original recording that's created when you're in the studio. And then it's mixed and mastered, and then copies are created and distributed.
So I do my master. I've mixed my music. I've mastered my music, and then I'm going to register it with the Copyright Office as a sound recording. That's my master, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and I think it's important to distinguish, which I believe we covered in the last interview, but just to cover it again, to distinguish between the sound recording, which is the master recording, and the underlying composition, which is the actual written music and lyrics, because a lot of times ownership is not the same in those two copyrights. A lot of times one person or entity owns the recording, and then a separate person or entity or multiple people own the composition, which is what people refer to as the publishing.
So if we go back to the Taylor Swift situation, is it safe to say that Taylor, along with a bunch of people, own the composition because she wrote her songs with other people and registered a performing arts copyright? Is that correct?
Correct, yes. She, along with her publishing company and then all the co-writers who helped to write the songs, would own the composition.
And then she goes into the studio and she records the master. And depending on what type of contract she has, she may own some, all, or none of the master. Is that correct?
Correct.
So if you're in a situation where you write your own music and then you go and you record it, but you work with a publishing company, I take it, and they have you sign something saying that you don't own your masters, then you don't own your masters. Is that right?
So the publishing company would not really be involved with the masters. They would be involved with the compositions. The
Oh.
masters would be owned by the record label.
Okay, so record labels. So now again, this is going into people that are involved with record labels. which is not typically an indie artist.
Right.
So we're back to what we talked about in our first conversation, which is contracts are so important. And you
Yes.
need to read them, people, and
Yes.
understand them and then decide if you're going to agree with it or not.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you're an indie artist and you're self-releasing your recordings, then you would own the masters. If you are an artist who is signed to a record label, almost always the record label will own the masters.
I wonder if she knew that going in. She was very young when she signed all this stuff. I wonder if she knew that going in and understood it or thought it would never be a problem. We may not ever know the answer to that, but
Yeah, I think I think our argument on both sides. As I said, nowadays, especially, it's like a buzzword. Every artist says they want to own their masters, and artists a lot of times are presented with deals from record companies, and they come to me and they say, "Oh, I just want to keep ownership of my masters." But unfortunately, if you're going to sign with a record label, that's a very difficult, maybe not quite impossible, but almost impossible if you're a new artist, to keep ownership of your masters. And the reason for that, or the justification for that, is because the label is going to pay for all the recording costs. So they're going to pay for the studio time, they're going to pay for the mixers, the engineers, the people to master it, and then they're going to pay for the marketing and promotion and the distribution and getting it on radio. And so because they're fronting all those costs and they have no guarantee that they're going to make any return on that investment, because in fact, most albums don't ever exceed the cost. They don't ever recoup all of the costs that the label spent. So because they're taking on all of that risk, they, in exchange, those masters are the label's property, basically, because they paid for them. So I think it's important for artists to understand that's why the label owns the masters. And probably with Taylor Swift, I would imagine that when she was first starting, she needed that recording budget, as most artists do. And so in exchange, because the label paid for the masters, they own them. Once artists get to a certain level, then they have a lot more leverage. And that's when they can try to negotiate to buy back their masters or to own their masters moving forward. For artists that are independent and not signed and doing everything and funding everything themselves, I mean, the benefit of that is that you keep ownership of everything. So you're having to pay for all these costs yourself, which, if you're an artist who has the budget to do that, that's great. And then you keep ownership of those masters. So those are your property and you're not having to sign them over to a record label.
and as a songwriter that does their own, I should say, pays for everything myself, I can now see how attractive this deal might be. You get your record made and you don't have to pay for it. And you might make a lot of money on the other end, or you might not, but you're not losing any money. So that I totally can see now why that would be so attractive for people to jump into a deal like that. But it's so important to understand what you're getting into, before you get into it, and you can weigh individually whether or not that's a good deal for you. So basically, if you sign away your master recordings, it's going to be really difficult to get back.
Right. And there's no guarantee. Occasionally you will see agreements that contain a provision that allows the artist to buy back their masters at a certain point. Most often those are with independent labels.
Oh.
And they're still pretty rare even then, but occasionally that will be there. Most often there's nothing in there that guarantees the artist the right to ever get their masters back. So it comes down to, at some point when the artist has become more successful, they can try to negotiate with the label, but the label does not have to agree to allow the artist to do it. And the label kind of dictates, what the price would be.
I would also think that since they own the master, they can sell it to whomever they want.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct.
All right. So again, so it's coming together now, going back to Taylor Swift, her situation and what she was talking about in terms of, one person selling it to another person. She didn't want that person to have it. And, that's what the big deal is. And she, of course, would love to own her masters from back then. But it sounds like even more than that, she just didn't want this other person to own them. So,
Right.
wow. Okay. I totally get it now. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, that happens all the time. If you look at right now, there are three major labels. And if you look at all the smaller labels underneath them, many of those labels were at one time independent labels, which later were bought by one of the three major labels and then just consolidated and consolidated and consolidated. So at one time, the masters owned by those smaller labels were not owned, were not underneath a major label. And then the smaller label got bought out. So now those masters are owned by Universal Music or Warner Music or Sony Music.
And again, that's completely out of the control of the artist if, in
Right.
fact, they don't own their master. So, are there other cases that jump out at you besides Taylor? Again, everybody knows all about Taylor because she's the latest, but do you recall anybody else that this happening to, but maybe it's a slightly different situation for them?
Yeah, I think a few other very well-known instances where this issue came up. Jay-Z, when he became president of Def Jam, supposedly part of that deal was he would agree to take the job if they would give him ownership of his prior masters back. So that was supposedly negotiated in exchange for him taking on that role of president of the label. Another well-known instance that a lot of people are familiar with is Prince. And Prince actually fought for a good portion of his career over this issue of getting his masters back. Supposedly why he changed his name at one point, when he changed his name to the symbol, that was kind of an attempt by him to get around this and to try to create music that would not be covered under his record contract and that he would own himself, because he thought if he recorded under a different name, then maybe it wouldn't be part of the contract. And he eventually did get ownership back, I think in 2014. Sadly, toward the end of his life, it took him to get his masters back, but he eventually did. And he was actually one of the first artists to really start experimenting with different ways of distributing music. So back when everyone was still sort of stuck on CDs and everything was CDs, Prince was one of the first artists who, at that point, those recordings later on in his career were his. And he started to experiment with different ways of distributing those online. So that's another very well-known instance of that. And then I think also Radiohead, they, I think, had a lot of issues with trying to get ownership of their masters back. And then they also, like Prince, started experimenting. I think they did an album where it was free, or it was name your own price and different things like that. And so when artists don't own their masters, they're not able to take those kind of experimental risks in how they're distributed. That's all determined by the label. But if the artist owns their masters, they can make those decisions as far as, you know what, let's give this album away for free, or let's let our fans decide how much they want to pay for this, or let's distribute it online when everybody else is still only doing CDs. Those kinds of freedom come along with owning your own masters.
So, going back to the Prince thing, it seems to me that uh wow, there's a lesson in just thinking that artists or stars are being eccentric.
Right.
Because I think that's of course what everybody thought, but there was potentially a really big purpose, a reason behind it,
Yes.
that nobody even realized.
Yes.
So remastering songs, that's been something that I've seen a lot. And I'm just curious. So do you remaster your song as an artist because you then would own that master and you're trying to get people to buy that version of it as opposed to the other one that you don't own? Or am I off the mark here?
I think there's sort of two separate issues. So one is remastering, where it's the same master recording, but it's the mastering process is redone. So the mix is the same, it's the same version of the recording, but somebody comes in and remasters it. So mastering, for those people listening who aren't familiar, is the kind of the final process in the recording. So first, the artist goes in the studio, they record all the different tracks, and they put the tracks together and mix them. And then once they have been mixed, the final person to touch the recording would be the person who is mastering it, where they kind of go and adjust the EQ, and they make sure that track 1 isn't 10 times louder than track 2. I think we've all probably had those situations where you're listening to an album and, you know, one track, the volume is fine, and then the next one blows out your eardrums. So those are the kind of things that people who are doing the mastering are supposed to fix, all of those potential issues. And so sometimes recordings will get what they call remastered. Usually that happens where it's an older recording and now there are new technologies available. So they take the original mix and then they remaster it using the new equipment to try to give it more of an updated sound. And there's a lot of disputes, again, amongst, you know, engineers and producers and things about whether that should be done, whether, you know, and whether it sounds better on the new equipment or whether it sounds better on the original equipment. But it is something that they do, and especially whenever there's new technology. So when CDs came around, they remastered them for CDs. Nowadays, when I would say most people are listening to music in earbuds or headphones, as opposed to like on a home stereo, they've remastered things to sound better, and specifically in headphones, or they've remastered them specifically for iTunes. And it all really just comes down to kind of adjusting the sound for new technologies. A lot of
Ah,
times too, I think it's also a marketing, you know, it can be a marketing thing. It's a way to sell the same album to somebody twice because now it's remastered. So if they're a really big fan, they want to hear how the remastered version sounds. One of the sort of most profitable times for the music industry was when CDs first came around and became popular, because they were able to essentially sell people albums that they already owned on vinyl or cassette again on CDs. So they were selling double albums. And remastering kind of has the same concept where you can get a consumer to buy the same album that they already own because it's remastered. But I
okay.
think that's a little different. I think your question may have to do more with, so you heard in some of the interviews, Taylor Swift suggested that she was going to re-record her songs and then release those new versions herself.
Yes.
Yeah, so that I was a little skeptical when I heard that, because most recording agreements that I have ever seen contain clauses that prevent the artist from re-recording the same compositions for a certain number of years. So if you release an album with a label and the label owns the recordings, you're prohibited under the contract from re-recording those same songs and then re-releasing them for a certain amount of time. Now it's possible that that time period on Taylor Swift's contract has run out and that she's now free to do that. But I think that it's important for artists to understand that it's not that simple, that you can't just decide you're not happy with your label, so you're going to go and re-record the songs and release them yourself, because you will most likely be prohibited by the contract from doing that at least for a certain number of years after the contract ends.
So that might be truer for artists that have been around for a long time, you know, maybe 30 years or something like that, that they then go back and redo it again, depending, like you said, on their contract. If the contract says 30 years, then okay, you're free in 30 years to do that. And there are, of course, some really big names that are still around 30 years later, so it would benefit them.
That's right. Yeah.
So, going back to the remastering idea too, I think I just want to add that, and again, this is based on experience. I don't record albums because I can't, I can't afford to make a whole album in one sitting. I can only do one single at a time. But the person that masters my music, um, Justin Coletti, got to give him a shout out because he's awesome. Justin actually masters my singles as if they were going to be on one album. So he's very careful to make sure that all of the levels for each individual song, even if they're not released for, 2 years in between, are
Hmm.
going to sound about the same. So I just want to kind of throw out there that if you do release your music one song at a time over a long period of time, hook up with a person that masters your music anyway. Like, don't skip that process. You don't just do it for an album. And I know that's not what you were suggesting, but I think, some people might say, oh, I don't have to do a single. You want to
Right.
master your singles, but make sure you are on the same page with the person that's doing the mastering. And if you want them to have that same level, then you need to express that to them, or of course hopefully they're saying it to you. When I first started, Justin said that to me, and I was like, yeah, okay. He's the expert. I let him do whatever he wants. And thank goodness, because otherwise I would have been like, nah, don't bother, and that would have been a mistake.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to stress to artists is don't skip the mastering process because it really makes such a big difference when something is well mastered versus not mastered at all. It makes it sound so much more professional, and some of these people that do mastering really can work wonders. I had something that I had recorded. It was just recorded in someone's apartment. It was not using expensive equipment, and I sent it to someone I know, and I asked him to raise the level on something, and he said, "You know what? Why don't you just let me master the whole thing?" And I thought, there's no way this is going to come out sounding well. It was not professionally recorded. I said, "But if you really want to master it, go ahead." And let me tell you, it was magic that they can work on these things. It just really, really night and day the difference between something that has been mastered and something that hasn't. So yeah, to all artists out there, don't skip that, especially if you're shopping your music around, and you're sending it out to people to listen to it. And then it's always best to have it sounding as professional as you can. So yeah, always get it mastered, whether it's a single or an album.
Yes, definitely. And I think in our previous conversations, we both also said that, like, always, always get your music
Mhm.
mastered. It doesn't matter if it's a single or an album, just do it. So I'm hoping that people will listen to that. And yes, and it's an expense. I mean, it shouldn't be astronomical, but music is expensive to make.
And it's interesting. Have you seen these new? I don't know how well they work, but they have these new automated mastering. It's like a website or an app. I don't even know, but you send them the track, and then 30 minutes later, it's mastered. And they use like algorithms to do it. I mean, I
Yes.
personally think it's best to use a human being to do these kind of things, but it's still interesting that this technology is being created.
Absolutely. I have actually seen it. And, I don't do it only because, again, Justin is just so good.
Yeah.
And I don't know that a machine can pick up on things the way the human ear can, depending on how good your ear is, and focus on certain things. I don't think it would be as good. I'm with you. I don't think it would be as good to do the machine. Now, granted, it might be cheaper, and if you're just looking for a quick master, you don't really care, then I guess it's fine. But I would definitely agree with you. I would go with a human over a machine. So, what else about owning your music do you want to express to the listeners? Again, we've been over details in the first few interviews, and now we're going really deep. But is there anything that we missed in the whole owning your masters side of the music industry?
Yeah, I think, you should view it as an asset. It's a piece of property. And if you retain ownership, that means at some point later on in the future, if Taylor Swift, for example, had owned her masters from the start of her career, the value of those masters, is so huge at this point that that would be an asset. So whoever, whether she owns them or whoever owns them, those are assets that as the artist becomes more popular, they go up in value. And I think that you, as an artist, if you have the budget to pay for your own recordings, and you don't have to give ownership of your masters in exchange for that recording budget, there are other types of situations that you can consider. So you could do a distribution deal, for example, where you're entering into an agreement with a company to help you distribute the music, but they're not going to own it. And that's really a big difference between a distribution deal and a record deal, is that, as we discussed, with a record deal, the record label owns the masters. With a distribution deal, the artist retains ownership, but the distribution company is going to help them distribute the music.
So we're talking essentially like CD Baby and DistroKid and um, TuneCore. Is that right? That's
Yeah,
pretty much what they do, right?
they do. So they technically, yeah, they're distributors. There are also distributors kind of one level above that. So CD Baby, TuneCore, DistroKid, they're going to get you out there to all the digital platforms, and they're not going to ask for much from you in exchange. But that's pretty much all that they're going to do. If you also need help with marketing or other types of things, then there are companies kind of one step above that, which will handle the distribution and maybe handle the marketing, but they're going to take more from you than what CD Baby or TuneCore will take. Even though they may not be taking ownership of the masters, they might take a percentage of sales, things like that. So it's kind of something to consider in terms of, I think as an artist, it's important to sit down and figure out what kind of budget you have and what type of services you need, and then figure out which scenario, whether it's the CD Babies and TuneCores where they're just going to get it out there and then it's up to you to handle marketing and everything else. And then in the middle, you have like a distribution deal where you keep ownership, but they're taking more of a percentage. Or then you have, the traditional record deal where they're going to own it and basically do everything for you. I think as an artist, you want to sit down and figure out what budget you have to pay for things on your own, because the more you're able to pay for on your own, the less of a percentage you're having to give away to other people. So, to the extent you can do that, I think you're probably better off in the long run. But of course, for most artists, it's just not practical. So you have to kind of figure out how much you're willing to give up in exchange for different services that you may need.
And I've been diving pretty deeply into the world of sync licensing.
Hmm.
And it would seem that if you do own everything, it's a whole lot easier to get a sync license deal
Right.
than if somebody owns the master and you own the composition and all that good stuff. But at the same time, I would think that the labels also it would be in their best interest to try to get some sync licenses done, and they have a whole department for that, I'm sure. So again, it's kind of it's a case by case scenario of which one you should go with. If you're approached with a deal from a record label, you really need to sit down and consider everything, which is why you need a lawyer. Yay.
Yes, exactly.
And I assume that you yourself have dealt with these situations where somebody gets approached by a label and they come to you and say, "What do I do, Cassandra?" And you sit maybe with them or go over everything and tell them the pros and cons and all that good stuff, or answer the questions and help them decide whether they should take the deal or not.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you have to weigh the pros and cons and figure out realistically what the artist could do on their own versus what the label could do for them, and figure out which scenario is the best, because many artists just don't have the resources or the skill set to handle all the administrative stuff that the label would handle for them. Those that do, can go on and end up, maybe less money, but spread out over a longer period of time. So it's sort of more sustainable. But it really just varies, yeah, from artist to artist.
Anything else that we want to talk about when it comes to owning your masters?
I think that's about it, other than which we touched on, I think, last time as well. But if you do own your masters, you want to absolutely make sure to register the copyright before you
Yes.
release them.
So very important. And again, that's another expense, but there are ways of doing it where you could um, register music as a group and pull them out one at a time, as you work on them. Something I have not taken advantage of, and I probably should. But Yeah, so important to register your music with the Copyright Office.
Definitely. Yep.
So, all right. Well, let's tell everybody how they can get in touch with you if they would like to consult with you and potentially have you as their attorney. I know so many people do, and they just love you.
I think the best way, you can go to my website, which is cspanglermusiclaw.com. And that has all the contact information on there. My email address, which you can use info@cspanglermusiclaw.com, but that's also on the website. Twitter is at cspan music law. Instagram at cspanesq, and then Facebook is facebook.com/music attorney. So you can find me anywhere on there. You'll find the phone number, email, and feel free to get in touch.
And it's just that easy. You are so accessible. You're a very busy person. So I don't know how you do it all, but you do. And I know I'm grateful for having you as an attorney. And again, I know just from seeing it on social media how many people are so happy that they have you as an attorney. And I should probably mention that you're in New York City,
Yep.
and but here I am in Florida, and yet you're still my attorney, so that works too, folks. You don't have to be in New York.
Yeah, and I try to be accessible. I think the number one complaint that I hear from people about attorneys is, the lack of communication or the lack of accessibility. So I really try to respond to everything that I get and respond, in a short turnaround time.
And we appreciate it. Thank you so much for talking to us again, because so many people need this information, and you say it in a way that people get it. So thank you very much. And you've done other interviews as well, which I know have been extremely popular, and it's just so necessary. So again, I thank you on behalf of myself and everybody in the music industry and everybody that wants to get into the music industry for taking your very precious time and laying things out for people so that they know what they're doing in this very complicated, crazy career that we're all trying to have.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's always a pleasure.
This was a conversation with music entertainment attorney Cassandra Spangler. If you'd like to get in touch with Cassandra, visit her website at cspanglermusiclaw.com.